Okay, hello and good morning, good evening, good afternoon. This is Meredith Ferris. Thank you for joining our CEADIR webinar discussion series webinar early. I'm really delighted to have you here. As you're joining, we welcome you to say hello in the chat. We are going to ask that you turn off your video and audio connections for today. We can help you do that as well. But again, just delighted to have folks starting to join us. We'll have a more official welcome as we get closer to our start time. But yes, thank you for joining early. And if you're having any technology issues, you can always chat me in the chat box. All right, terrific. So nice to see folks logging online. This is somewhat of an unofficial welcome. My name is Meredith Ferris. I'm one of the technology producers for today's webinar, and we're just delighted to have you signing in. As you're joining, we ask you to make sure that your video is off and that you're on mute. We're going to plan on having a lot of folks today. We would like to have you say hello, though, so if you could go to the chat box, we'd really like you to say hello and share where you're calling in from today before we start our official welcome and kickoff. Thank you, Mark. Nice to see you here. Welcome from the Philippines. Good evening to you. Thanks again to folks who are joining us online. Really nice to have you with us. We're asking as you log on today, if you wouldn't mind, please turning off your video and make sure that you're on mute. But we would like to hear from you and where you're calling in from today. So if you could please share that in the chat box. You can see that Mark has joined us from the Philippines. Ramila from Mumbai, India. Nice to have you with us. Welcome. Bianta from Indonesia. Terrific. Thank you all. We really appreciate you joining early. Jamal from Indonesia, great to have you with us. And again, this is Meredith Ferris. I'm unofficially welcoming you today. I'm one of today's technology producers. We're just making sure that everything is working well for this event. The real official start will happen in a few minutes, but thank you again for logging on early. As folks are logging in, if you haven't had a chance to yet, we would love to have you share your name and your location where you're calling in from today. We're delighted. We've got such a good response to this webinar. We're just really excited to see so many folks joining us online. And again, hopefully you're in the right place. This is for the cost-benefit analysis, mangrove conservation versus shrimp aquaculture in Bintuni Bay in Mimika, Indonesia. Welcome, Taj. Nice to see you. Thank you for joining from Malaysia. If anybody is having any connection issues, please do let us know. Hopefully the audio is clear for you. And we'll officially be starting in a few minutes. We really appreciate you joining today. We got a lot of great questions already that came in through the registrations. If you have a question in mind already for our speakers that you want to put online, we're happy to see it. Want to say welcome to the additional folks who are joining us. Lovely to have you here. We're asking everyone, if you wouldn't mind, to please turn off your video, make sure that you're on mute, but we would like to hear from you and where you're from. So if you could put your name and your location in the chat box, that would be great. All right, again, just saying welcome to folks as you join in. Really nice to see so many folks joining us so far. Again, delighted to have you here. My name is Meredith Ferris. I'm one of the technology producers for today's event, so here to help if you have any technology issues. As you join, we are asking that if you would please make sure that you are on mute and that your video is off. If you could please, in the chat, say hello, where you're calling in from today with your name. So far, we've got folks from India, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia. So a wonderful international group joining us today. Really nice to have you join us. Bara from Indonesia, Miguel from Canada for COVID, but working in Honduras. Great. Very international crowd today, which is excellent. Great, another participant from Indonesia. Nice to have you all with us. Really delighted that you could be here. We'll be more officially starting in a few minutes. If you're having any technology issues, please do let me know in the chat box. Again, my name is Meredith, and I'm happy to support you. And again, welcome to the CEADIR discussion series webinar on cost-benefit analysis. I know that we have a lot of folks joining today, and thank you all for being on mute and having your video off for now. We really appreciate it. We'll be starting the session officially in about 6 minutes as we continue to let folks join. And again, if you're just joining now, and for those of you who've been online for a while, I'm sorry that you hear my intro multiple times, but we are delighted to have you here. As you're joining today, please share your name and where you're calling in from. For folks who are brand new, since you can't see the earlier chats, we have folks all the way from Indonesia and the Philippines to Malaysia, Canada, but working in Honduras, and several other locations. Reza from Florida, excellent. Nice to see you with us. So folks, for today, we are going to ask that you have your video off and that you do have yourself on mute. So if you've got your video on, we're going to ask you to turn that off. I can't turn it off for you today. So what you're going to want to do is go to the very bottom of your screen. You'll see there's 3 buttons: a microphone, a phone, handheld phone, and then a video. If you click the video, so where the red is showing and there's a line through it, that's how you can make sure that your video is off. We can and may mute if your line comes off if you come off the line. So we are just going to ask that folks do stay on mute as far as possible today. Again, we just have a lot of folks joining us. We love having you here. We would like to see your introduction in the chat box. So if you haven't yet, please share your name and where you're calling in from today. And if you could, please take a moment now to make sure that your video is off. Great. So Vianta, Izroni, Zohamsa, all 3 of you, I can see that your videos are on. So if you don't mind, I'll ask you to turn them off. Not that we don't like seeing your lovely faces. We're just trying to keep it easy for today. And also, as you know, when webinars go on, sometimes there's lots of background interruptions. Great. So nice to see the introductions. Welcome, Bob, from calling in from Virginia. And to others. Liawe and Hesrone, just checking if you all could please turn off your videos. And Jusper, your video is on as well. Again, for today's session, we're asking everyone to please turn off your video and mute your audio. That will help. That will help for today's session. Okay. Thank you all again for joining. Again, I know that for several of you, you've heard my introduction a few times. I'm Meredith Ferris. I'm one of the technology producers today. And so we'll be starting more officially in just 3 minutes. I'm asking if you wouldn't mind to please ensure you are on mute and that your video is off. If you could share your name and where you're calling in from today, that would be great. We're going to get started with the speakers in just a few minutes. And I'm just asking a few individuals if you wouldn't mind turning off your cameras, not that we don't enjoy seeing you, but for today's session, just to keep the screen clean and to make sure that there's no background interruptions, that would be best. So please turn your video off for today. Again, at the very bottom of your screen, you'll see 3 buttons. You want to go to the one that looks like a camera and click on it so that it turns red to make sure you are off video. I'm sending a few personal messages. If you wouldn't mind, then you see that your video is on. If you could please turn it off. So, Mimika, and Hokwe, if you wouldn't mind turning off your videos for today. I know you've probably been on a lot of webinars recently in which we want videos on. Today, we're asking if you could please turn your videos off. We would really appreciate it. Okay. Due to some bandwidth concerns today, we are asking that folks please do turn off your videos. So Hatsuri, Mimika, and Hokwe, if you all could please turn off your videos, that would be great. And welcome to Josa. Nice to have you with us. And Nirmal. Great, we've got so many folks from all over the world, people everywhere from Virginia to the Philippines, folks in Kenya. Excellent, and we have people continuing to come into the meeting. We'll be starting in just a minute or so where I'll hand it over officially to our speakers. And so again, for today, for bandwidth considerations and to make sure that everything is running clean and clear, we do ask you to please turn off your videos. Mohammed Mumbayelo Hokwe, if you don't mind, we'd ask that you please turn off your video. And again, if you're looking for where to do that, it's at the very bottom of your screen. For folks who can't turn off your video, unfortunately, I'm going to have to move you out of the meeting and you can rejoin in a few minutes. If you wouldn't mind, please do turn off your video. Okay. Well, and with that, we are at 9.
I think we're going to get started. Okay, hello everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our participants, and a special welcome to those of you joining us from Indonesia at this late evening. Welcome to our webinar, Cost-Benefit Analysis, Mangrove Conservation versus Shrimp Aquaculture in Bintuni Bay and Mimika, Indonesia. Brought to you by the Climate Economic Analysis for Development, Investment, and Resilience, or CEADIR activity, financed by the U.S. Agency for International Development. This webinar is part of a series to disseminate CEADIR's work. It started on August 6th with CEADIR's Climate Finance Assessment and includes 6 more webinars in the coming months. I want to give thanks to the USAID Sharing Environment and Energy Knowledge, or SEEK project, for their support in hosting today's webinar platform. Next slide. My name is Pablo Torres with Crown Agents USA. I am CEADIR's Chief of Party, and I've been with CEADIR since July 2015. CEADIR is a $20 million USAID activity that helps governments, the private sector, and civil society make the business and economic case for climate change mitigation and adaptation actions. And that helps to accelerate public and private financing for clean energy, sustainable landscapes, and adaptation. CEADIR is truly a diverse activity, as we have conducted a couple of dozen sub-activities in over 30 countries since 2014. Today, we have with us 2 panelists who work on this cost-benefit analysis, Dr. Gordon Smith and Ben Brown. We also have the pleasure of having Dr. Julian Akima from USAID to moderate the webinar. Dr. Akama is Senior Climate Change and Sustainable Landscapes Advisor with USAID's Global Climate Change Office, and she will provide introductory remarks, including references to USAID's portfolio of work on mangroves. Ben Brown is a Senior Advisor and co-founder of Blue Forests, an Indonesian nonprofit that works with local people for sustainable use and restoration of mangroves. He will follow Dr. Akama to provide a context for the activity in Indonesia and describe its design and data collection. Dr. Smith will then present the CBA's approach, results, and sensitivity analysis. Dr. Smith has served as the technical lead for sustainable landscapes for CEADIR since 2014. He's a principal at Eco4 LLC, focusing on mitigating greenhouse gas emissions by changing land use, especially forestry and agriculture quantification and offset accounting. Our panelists are going to present for about 40 minutes, and then we will have time for a Q&A session. Please submit your questions for the panelists through the Google Meet chat window as we go along, and Dr. Akama, as moderator, will pose as many of them as possible to our panelists at the end. And as a reminder to those of you who just joined us, please turn off your video. Before I turn it over to Dr. Akama, next slide, please. Before I turn it over to Dr. Akama, I'd like to mention two other CEADIR studies on mangroves valuation that are very relevant in today's webinar. The first is a 2017 cost-benefit analysis of mangrove restoration for coastal protection and an earthen dike alternative in Mozambique to inform decisions to protect the residents in the peri-urban areas of Kilimani from sea level rise, cyclones, flooding, and erosion. The CBA considered three scenarios: business as usual, mangrove restoration, and a 5,000-meter earthen dike. The CBA found that financial and economic net present values of mangrove restoration were positive and exceeded those of the earthen dike under all scenarios in the base case and all the sensitivity analysis. Next slide. The second study is a 2018 report that describes methods for valuing the market and extra market goods and services provided by mangroves, which analyzed 28 mangrove valuation studies in developing countries. The study found that regulating services of mangroves, or the effects on ecosystem functions such as air and water purification, climate regulation, and erosion prevention, had the highest adjusted average annual value, followed by cultural services, and then provisioning services such as food, water, and raw materials. The few studies that tried to estimate the total value of mangroves had an adjusted annual average value of $7,350 per hectare. The average annual per hectare value was highest for the benefit transfer method, followed by replacement cost and alternative cost methods, travel cost approach, contingent evaluation, and market valuation methods. Lastly, few studies have valued the carbon sequestration benefits of mangroves. In this study, CEADIR estimated the value of the accumulated carbon stock and the present value of future mangrove carbon sequestration per hectare of mangroves. Both reports are available on the USAID Development Experience Clearinghouse website, and links are provided in the references slide of this presentation. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Akama from USAID. Welcome, Julianne.
Thank you, Pablo, and thank you to everyone who's joining us for this webinar. It's exciting to see how much interest there is in this topic. Mangrove forests are estimated to cover a mere 140,000 square kilometers worldwide. This is only 2.5% of the extent of the Amazon forest. But these ecosystems have an outsized impact on ecosystem services. For example, mangroves can absorb up to 4 times as much carbon as a similar area of terrestrial forests, and most of this carbon is actually stored in the soil. They're also critical nursery habitats for fish, birds, and marine mammals, in addition to invertebrates, lizards, Bengal tigers, and many other species. They filter water, provide wood and non-wood products, and they afford effective coastal protection from storm surges, hurricanes, and tsunamis. But 35% of mangroves were lost in just 20 years between 1980 and 2000. and they continue to be lost at a rate of about 1 to 2% each year due to sea level rise and changes in rainfall, but especially due to human activities, including wood harvest, conversion to aquaculture, agriculture, and infrastructure. Because mangroves provide so many benefits, USAID works on mangroves in many places and in many different ways. I'm going to try to give you just a little flavor of the diversity of USAID's mangrove-related programming. In Bangladesh's Sundarbans, the largest mangrove forest in the world, USAID works on tiger conservation. It's organized resource user groups to manage mangroves and supported ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change through co-management of wetland and forest ecosystems. In West Africa, USAID's West Africa Biodiversity and Climate Change Program, known as WABIC, worked on education, helping communities understand how valuable the mangroves were for their livelihoods, and restoration and replanting of mangroves in Sierra Leone. And there's a new program in 11 coastal West African countries that's focused on women's empowerment and food security through mangrove conservation and co-management of shell fisheries by women. In the Philippines, USAID helped Zamboanga City develop a mangrove forest plan to improve conservation and management of the remaining mangroves that provide essential ecosystem services to this city. In Indonesia, mangrove projects include marine protected areas that extend as far as the mangroves, long-term management plans, mapping, and natural resource planning and monitoring. For example, USAID through the Lestari and Sea programs has worked in Papua, including Bintuni Bay and Mimika, which we're going to hear more about today, to support rights-based and community-based resource management that incorporates traditional knowledge and relationships and promotes an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. USAID also supports global research. Oh, next slide. USAID also supports global research on mangroves. The Sustainable Wetlands Adaptation and Mitigation Program, or SWAMP, is a research program that's focused on understanding carbon dynamics and management in tropical mangroves and peatlands. It's implemented by the US Forest Service and C4 and numerous universities around the world. This program has generated important understanding of carbon dynamics in these systems, and the research has been critical to enabling countries to incorporate wetlands in their greenhouse gas inventories, in their national wetland strategies, and in their emission reduction plans. For example, swamp research in Indonesia found that carbon stocks in Mimika Bay, one of the sites that we're going to hear about for the analysis today, were way higher than was expected. In Vietnam, SWAMP is using social and environmental data and developing decision support tools to guide management and restoration. USAID and SWAMP helped establish the Mangrove Research and Training Forest in the Rufiji Delta, Tanzania, and supported local PhD students there to research carbon cycling and restoration. And with the IUCN, the program recently published a mangrove restoration guide for the West Indian Ocean. In the Caribbean and Mesoamerica, swamp scientists are connecting mangrove health with coral reef health in ridge to reef approaches. And they're examining the coastal protective value of mangroves in the Caribbean and their resilience to increasing frequencies and intensities of hurricanes since the 1980s. I've barely scratched the surface with these examples, but this type of research provides critical information on ecosystem services and other inputs for the type of cost benefit we're about to see. Understanding trade-offs and taking into account a full suite of economic and ecosystem impacts is really key for making good development and conservation decisions. And now I'm pleased to turn it over to Benjamin Brown to talk about uses of mangroves, survey design, and field data collection.
Hi, everybody. Great to see so many familiar faces and some new people. I'm joining today from Darwin in the Northern Territory of Australia, and as such, I would like to start my talk with an acknowledgement of country. As is traditional here, I acknowledge that the Larrakia people are the traditional owners of the Darwin region and pay my respects to Larrakia elders past and present, and I'm committed to a positive future for the Aboriginal community. Thanks for that. I feel that's entirely appropriate given today's topic especially. So my name is Ben Brown. I was with the Mangrove Action Project a long time ago, and then Blue Forest starting in about 2010. Lived in Indonesia for 20 years, and I'm currently in Darwin pursuing a PhD at Charles Darwin University. Next slide. So I I reckon most people that have joined this webinar know a bit about the plight of mangroves globally. I guess I'll just highlight that in Indonesia, there are different surveys. The Ministry of Environment and Forestry currently recognized 3.3 million hectares of mangroves Indonesia-wide, 1.5 of which are deforested or severely degraded, leaving us with about 1.8, remnant 1.5 million hectares. 1.8 million hectares have been degraded and deforested. And so down at the bottom of the slide, I start to, and the next slide, but at the bottom of the slide are some photos we took from the survey sites. On the far left is Mimika, and that's lowland swamp forest being converted to oil palm plantation. It's adjacent to the mangroves there. That was a 30,000 hectare planned project that the USAID IFACS program at the time successfully stopped in its tracks, which was good. The next slide shows some infrastructure development. Districts in Indonesia commonly split as they grow. And, oh, sorry, I meant the next photo on the last slide. And yeah, and that infrastructure development, unfortunately in Mimika, where most things are mangroves by the coast, eats into the mangroves 1,000 hectares or 2,000 hectares per new district. So not pretty substantial. And on the far right there's a photo of the sawmill, which is a legally operated forestry concession in Bintuni Bay. It actually has FSC Gold certification and is pretty well managed. I'll talk a little about that today. Next. Yeah, so reasons for mangrove clearance, specifically in Indonesia, a lot for aquaculture. It's still happening, although it's slowed down the rate. The lifespan of ponds in Indonesia is a maximum of 10 years, so says the literature, and many become unproductive after just a few years of operation as disease spreads, and some landscapes aren't appropriate for aquaculture at all. There's a new driver of deforestation in Indonesian mangroves that was first published, I think, by Richards and Fries a couple of years ago. And that's conversion to oil palm. They're doing a lot of major landworks, changing mangroves directly into oil palm with dike walls and filling in tidal creeks. And although there's legal timber plantations in Indonesia, a couple of them, there's a decent amount of subsistence timber gathering, although I would say that local people, rural villagers, by and large, protect their mangroves. And these larger outside drivers of degradation are responsible for most of the clearance in Indonesia. Next slide. The purpose of our study was a cost-benefit analysis of conserving mangroves versus the partial conversion for aquaculture as the main driver of deforestation of mangroves in Indonesia. And I guess on this slide, I'll just call your attention to the difference between the financial values that we looked at and the economic values, which Gordon will go into greater depth on. And some people split up mangrove values into direct and indirect use, options values, intrinsic values, or there's other ways of stratifying mangrove values. Ours looked mostly at financial values, which were largely direct values, as well as economic values, which were kind of combined direct and indirect or ecosystem service values. But Gordon will speak more to that. I think the thing to pay attention to there is there's going to be a big gap between the financial value and economic value of mangroves in Indonesia. And to me, that represents the key finding of this work, which we can elaborate on in question and answer, and has management implications. Next. Major mangrove values, a lot of you may know. Things we really looked at in Papua were fisheries value. Healthy mangroves are responsible in some way for about 70% of nearshore fisheries, give or take. Timber, high value storm protection in some places. In our study sites, Bintuni Bay is a long protected bay, and the geomorphology of the bay kind of protects it as well from storms. And the southern coast of Papua, Mimika, and Asmat are relatively well protected from being on the equator, where they're not prone to cyclones, and protection from this big landmass I'm sitting on in Australia. Carbon sequestration, to be sure, and we'll go into that, as well as water regulatory services, buffering saltwater, intrusion, things like that. Next. Yeah, I'd be remiss not to mention cultural values in Papua, especially. The Chamorro people in Mimika identify themselves as the saltwater people, Mimikawe. They, their ancestors are some of the mangroves, as well as some of the fauna that live amongst the mangroves, which are venerated. I guess we didn't quantify this value, but it just would drive up the overall value of the two mangrove landscapes we looked at. And I think I also need to say traditional management practices in that region are strong, have weakened a little over the years, but pay a lot of attention to the mangroves. And these people have stewarded what might be the most pristine mangrove large landscape in the world, I think. I'll talk a little about that later too. Next. I hope I'm doing well for time. I'm not going to read through much of this slide, except maybe to expand that in the context of Papua, so there's two provinces on the Indonesian side of Papua. The other country, Papua New Guinea, shouldn't be confused with Indonesian Papua, which is consists of Papua province and West Papua province. And in 2001, Indonesia granted special autonomy to the forests of Papua for the use of Papuan people, traditional indigenous Papuans. That's coming up for review in 2021, and it's a real important time. It's being discussed right now in the Indonesian Congress, and there's a lot of fear that there's attempts to degrade traditional ownership rights, these sovereign rights over the forest in Papua for economic development. There's pressure for sure. And I won't go too political into that, but I feel that this study that we just undertook can help inform some management decisions and policy decisions that are about to be made, which will impact one of the globe's most important forest resources, and that's Indonesian Papua. Next. Yeah, so finally we get to the geography of where our study sites. We had two, Bintuni Bay up in West Papua and Mimika, a district down in Papua province on the southern coast. Very large mangrove areas, 260,000 hectares and 244,000. And the Mimika mangroves abut to the west with Kaimana. I think Barakala Robin joined our webinar today, and he's been working out there with Conservation International. Shout out, Barrett. And Asmat to the east. All told, maybe 500,000 plus hectares of very big speciose mangroves, and those are adjacent to another 1 million to 1.5 million hectares of lowland swamp forest. A huge natural system, not the world's largest mangrove, which would be in the Sundarbans, India and Bangladesh, but probably the world's most carboniferous or productive mangrove area. Next. Mangrove uses quantified in this study you can read. We looked at 4 major extractive uses: fisheries, timber, hunting and gathering, and that palm products is the Nipa palm, the only member of the palm family which is a true mangrove. And some non-extractive uses, mainly carbon sequestration. We looked at storm and tsunami protection, and Gordon will explain it wasn't captured necessarily in our landscapes, and notifications covering my last sentence there, so you guys can read it. Next slide, please. In terms of data collection, methodology, etc., my team at Blue Forest, based in Makassar, South Sulawesi, and 2 consultants who helped us out, developed a methodology led by Gordon Smith, based in Seattle, which included lit review. We got a lot of secondary data from the provincial and district governments of Bintuni and Papua, Mimika. And we undertook 120 household surveys in 6 villages, 3 in each landscape. I won't talk too much more about data collection, but we, in each of the villages, we had a focus group discussion followed by the deliverance of household surveys, which had 3 to 8 members present for each survey. Next. And here's my final slide before I hand it over to Gordon, just showing some of the results. And you can see number of households involved in a certain livelihood activity in each landscape, Bintuni Bay and Mimika. Their average revenue per household in US dollars per year, annual, and costs. And those were the raw information for us to perform various cost benefit analyses which Gordon's going to go through. And I think the trend, my last sentence here is noticing some trends here. Fishing was important in both landscapes, although they have better market access in Bintuni, which might have increased their revenue. Farming is a little more important in Bintuni, whereas hunting and gathering is very important in Mimika, where they go into the lowland swamp forest for boar, tree kangaroo, giant Pacific freshwater turtle, which is endangered but plentiful in that region, cassowary, another endangered animal that's not at all endangered if you hang around in Mimika and Asmat. And then the timber was mostly a value felt in Bintuni Bay, where there's a legal concession. So that's the end, I think, for me. I think the next slide is Gordon. So I'll just introduce briefly, and then he can introduce himself. Gordon Smith, who I met through this project. So I'd like to thank him for the opportunity to do this, to join in on this research, learn more about economics. I ended up including a chapter on cost-benefit analysis of mangrove restoration in my PhD thesis, thanks to this tutelage from Gordon. And he's from Seattle, and I just enjoyed, that's where I'm from as well. And I just enjoyed all our talks and just hearing a little about the drizzle in the background in Seattle. And I think it plays on Gordon's demeanor as well. He's got a nice dry sense of humor, even though he lives in a wet place. Okay, sorry for all the comedy. Take it away, Gordon, thank you.
All right, thanks, Ben. And yes, just in case anybody wants to know, it is presently raining in Seattle. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about the actual cost-benefit study that we did and the results. And I'm going to skim over a lot of the details. I'll encourage you to look at the report. It's freely available. We had two cases, a baseline case of what's been happening in these areas historically, and then we had an alternative case that said what would happen if conversion to aquaculture happened at rates observed at some other points. Some other places in the world, if that happened in the future. And we also had sensitivity analysis where we would vary some of the parameters and see what happened, how the results changed as these parameters change. One of the biggest factors that we changed was the discount rate, because USAID specifies that the base case discount rate is 12% per year, which is the kind of rate that you might apply to a commercial investment. And many people argue that social policy and social investments should use much lower discount rates. So we also did alternative studies at 3% per year and 7% per year. One thing I'll point out, well, go ahead, next slide. The base case is very low conversion, which is why these two areas are substantially intact. To the extent that there has been conversion, it's been mainly for developing villages and related infrastructure. And it's been very, very low rate of conversion, 0.05% per year. Over 50 years, where you get cumulative, you've only converted less than 3% of the total area. Next slide. In contrast, many other mangroves in the world, as Julian and Ben pointed out, have been converted. And although a lot of that has been for developed uses, and a lot of it's been aquaculture. Because these are remote areas, the most plausible development alternative here is aquaculture. And what we estimated is a 0.75% conversion rate per year, which doesn't sound like much, but it adds up to over half of the net reduction over 100 years, even after you consider that these ponds have a very short lifespan, and after a decade or two, they reconvert themselves back to mangroves, which doesn't happen 100% of the time, but happens on average. And one of the things I'll point out is that I saw Daniel, my apologies in advance for garbling your name, Murdoyoso, was very helpful in turning us on to research that's been done by C4 and the U.S. Forest Service, where folks have actually gone out and measured carbon stocks in mangroves and loss. And we use their numbers, including studies in these study areas, and that 89% of the carbon in soil and biomass is lost on conversion to aquaculture ponds. Next slide, please. We do have limitations, as Ben noted. We did not try to quantify the cultural values. We just thought that was a little too problematic. We also did not put a value on the nursery habitat that mangroves provide for offshore fisheries. Everybody who's looked at this believes there is a connection, but the connections are very complicated, and it depends. It's not a linear relationship, and it would have been a huge additional modeling project to try to tease out those relationships. It depends on how intense the fishing pressure is offshore, and a number of other factors, and weather. And so we left that out, and keep that in mind, because that could be significant and could skew our results to undervaluing mangroves. And also, this isn't a limitation, but it's more of an applicability, that the responses, the ecological responses, and thus the productivity responses, are going to be different in narrow strips of mangroves versus large areas like these. In a narrow strip, a small amount of removal of mangroves could essentially make them non-functional. It's possible. Next slide. So now we get into the actual numbers. Remember, this is at a 12% discount rate. That's very high. And the point here is that for both sites, the difference between the conservation scenario, which is the business as usual scenario, and the aquaculture development scenario, even though aquaculture tends to have a high number of dollars per hectare return, it's only for a while, and you give up the values of the intact mangroves. And so this is the financial value, only looking at the values faced by the people who are using these mangroves, not the value to society. They're almost the same. And if you considered the cultural values and the spawning and nursery values for open water fisheries, it could be that the conservation scenario is more valuable than the development scenario. Next slide. More on the financial results. And again, this is not considering social values like storm protection and carbon sequestration. At the lower discount rates, even the financial value was higher for conservation than for aquaculture. That's the key take-home message, is once you get the discount rate down, even not considering the social values like carbon sequestration, it's still more valuable to conserve the mangroves. Next slide. So economic analysis includes social values, and our main social value here is the social cost of carbon. And even we analyze costs 0, 5, 8, 15, and $25 per ton carbon dioxide equivalent. And the point here is that any of the non-zero costs, social costs of carbon that we analyzed, the conservation value is greater than the development value. So once you add in carbon, conservation's more valuable. Another thing you should note is you look at the size of the numbers in this table, they're 50, 75 times greater than the financial values. So the economic values are vastly greater than the economic values. Or excuse me, the economic values are vastly greater than the financial values. And the financial values are included in these economic analysis results. And also note, as Ben talked about, these are very protected sites. And so even though we put cyclones and tsunamis in the modeling, there was no history of cyclones or tsunamis at this site, so therefore no damage, so thus no avoided damage. And other parts of the world that do have exposure to cyclones and tsunamis, those values would be significant at those other locations. Next slide. So back to the big picture again, just to hammer it home. Once you include the carbon storage benefits, conservation is higher value. And how do these things scale? It basically scales with the cost of carbon. The higher the cost of carbon, the more valuable conservation is, and the more valuable it is relative to conversion to aquaculture. As your discount rate decreases, the degree to which conservation is more valuable than development increases. And also, the longer your time period, if you only do a short time period, the financial value of the aquaculture can be higher, but the longer your time period, the more that conservation becomes more valuable than the conversion. Next slide. And again, to reiterate, just in case you've forgotten, these are some of the things that some of the parameters that we valued in the sensitivity analysis. Next slide. And again, to reiterate, just so that you get it, lower discount rate, conservation more valuable, higher carbon price, higher value, and the economic value largely scales with the carbon price. And the real eye-opener here is that at a $25 a ton CO2 social cost of carbon, more than 99% of the total value, economic value, was the carbon value. All the other values are much, much smaller. Next slide. So we also did a Monte Carlo analysis, and I should say by we, I mean David Cooley, who is on this call. I would like to give a shout out to David. If you want some good analysis, David's your guy. So I'm going to start out with having a brief description of what is Monte Carlo analysis. And you define some parameters. In this case, population growth rate, deceleration in the growth rate, the profitability of the ponds, the length of the pond life, the logging rate, variation in fishing revenue, probabilities of tsunami and cyclones, the death rates from tsunami and cyclones, and the number of houses destroyed in tsunami and cyclones. So for each one of these parameters, such as the probability of a tsunami, you would define a probability distribution function. In this case, it might be a bell-shaped curve. It might be constant probability over a certain range. It might be a center point with equally declining probability as you go to the edge. It might be like tsunamis. It's never going to be below zero, and it's going to be likely to be zero and very rarely to be above zero. So it'll be a distribution that will be lumped towards zero, but have a longer tail toward higher. So you define a probability distribution for each one, and then you have a computer, you do a run. And for each run, the computer rolls the dice, Monte Carlo, and gets a value from your random value from your probability distribution for each thing. It'll get a value for population growth rate, a value for deceleration in population, etc. And then it'll do the economic analysis with that set of values. And then it repeats that and does 10,000 runs. And so what you're doing is you're getting a probability distribution of NPV values, net present value values. And what this does is it simulates, because the world is not average. So it says, what's the chance that the outcome is going to be different from your average outcome? Next slide. So when you roll the dice and you go, okay, what's the variability? Even when you exclude the value of carbon, because of the fact that the world in the individual case is not the same, is not an average value. When we did the runs, that conservation was more valuable than shrimp ponds in between 1/4 and 1/3 of the model runs, even at a 12% discount rate. So even though on average, conversion to shrimp ponds was more valuable, between 1/4 and 1/3 of the time, if you consider the variability of the world, conservation was more valuable. And once you count the carbon storage benefits, almost all the model runs, conservation is more valuable. Next slide. And this will give you the rates. And I'll encourage you to, and it'll give you the variation. The numbers in parentheses down in this table down below are 2 standard deviations for you, those of you who are statistically inclined, which meant 95% of the cases fell within this range. And what you can see is that in percentage terms, the ranges are bigger under conservation than under conversion, or bigger under the financial rather than under economic NPV. And that's because there was less uncertainty about the carbon values. Next slide. At this point, I will turn it back to Julianne to moderate questions.
Thank you, Gordon, and thank you, Ben. That was really interesting. And just note that we have more than 180 participants from more than a dozen countries between the 2 platforms that we're listening to this. So there's a lot of interest in this question, or in this topic. I'm just going to pull some questions that have come in over the chat and that came in before the event. So this is one that we got early on. Can you talk about how local residents are participating in the decision making, and talk a little bit more about that community involvement that we saw? I think this is probably for you, Ben, but I'll leave it open.
Okay, thanks. I guess in this particular bit of research, it was, people were respondents to questionnaires. I engaged in this CEADIR supported research while myself and my organization was involved in a 10-year project called USAID-IFAX and then Lestari in Mimika and Asmat in the south. So I'll use them as examples. And I guess, especially in the, once we got to know communities in the mangrove areas in Mimika and Asmat and doing community-based kind of NGO style work, livelihoods work, some education work, et cetera, and identified empowered individuals. I think the most interesting thing the USAID Lestari project achieved, and there's some documents that we can share as well on this, was engaging indigenous owners, traditional owners, in formal governance processes like spatial planning, village level development planning, all the way up to the district and even provincial level, influencing how those plans are created, making space for collaborative management in those systems, getting village, transparently asking for and receiving village development budgets from the central government, and engaging in collaborative forestry under Indonesia's new social forestry laws. Men and women, youth, we're all part of this project, and I just think a lot of that was captured in their ability eventually in the last couple of years to join and engage and influence these planning processes to help protect their forests against threats of development, et cetera, and collaborate with this parallel governance system. And I just think, the one project is called Kampung Lestari. We had a document on this approach, and it's been adopted since the end of Lestari this year by the planning departments at the provincial level in both West Papua and Papua as a best practice tool that they're using across the whole area, across the province in the next 5-10 years. So anyway, we can share some more documents that show exactly how people were engaged. But yeah, that's my answer.
And if I can add also, the survey work was done by an Indonesian team, and as part of that, there's going to be discussion with the local people about, what are your values? And so there'll be a bit of, they use the word sensitization, but I would say, kind of getting people to think about what their values are and how they're going to pursue them. I'll turn that back to Julianne.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about how you make an economic rationale for conservation versus developing aquaculture? So how you take this information and use it to, how policymakers might use this information, and what that general economic rationale is between those.
So I'll jump in on this and then give Ben a shot to give a different view. So that's complicated. In many parts of the world, business and economic development are given a lot of credence. And so a study like this can show that mangrove conservation is more valuable than conversion to shrimp ponds, and the people who are there are better off. Now, there's also a body of literature that says that science and scientific observations have limited effect on policy. So I would refer people to there's a lot of science, there's the research on how do you get a political decision, because many of these decisions about land use are political, and some of them are designating allowable and appropriate uses. Some of them are what are subsidies and what's promoted, and some of them are laws enforced. And so you're now into the world of politics and institutions and how do you have governance? You also, these studies can give local people a justification in the outside world for consideration of their needs and values. And I could go on at this, but time is short, so I'll give Ben a shot, and then we should probably get to more questions.
Okay, I'll answer this a little differently. I guess living in Indonesia 20 years and working in this field the whole time, I've seen aquaculture in landscapes which is a total failure, in deltas where it doesn't belong, on the north coast of Java where they've converted 95% of the mangroves and they've got erosion and subsidence as a result, and people can't make a living off aquaculture, to some profitable areas where people make $1,200 a hectare a year for 20 years. The interesting thing there is it's been hard for people. There's pressure for people to capture values from mangroves. And when it's commonly accessible or commonly managed, you have to have a cooperative shared system to benefit from those values. And there's just a lot of cultural and global economic pressure to put a fence around something, make it a square, own it, and manage it for in a simple way to make the business model simple. And you know, sometimes aquaculture works, and a lot of times it doesn't, to the detriment of the coast. I think the thing one of the things this report pointed out to me, that vast gap between the financial value and the economic value of 2 orders of magnitude almost, has management implications. On the one hand, the financial value of mangroves is too low, and we need to work harder at recognizing some of those direct use values and multiplying them through market chains, et cetera, so that it's just worth more for local people and investors to use mangroves as they are. Nipa palm, which was mentioned in this talk, is one example. It used to be the world's largest source of industrial alcohol in the 19th century. It got replaced by sugarcane and beets, and now it's not used at that level anymore, but it could be. There's 800,000 to 1 million liters of sap per hectare can be harvested every year without ruining the forest, keeping carbon intact, et cetera, driving palm sugar or bioethanol industries. So you can raise that financial value. At the same time, the economic value, which is high, isn't felt by a lot of people. And we still have issues in Indonesia with realizing, you know, there's a carbon market, but there's almost no approved blue carbon projects yet in Indonesia. And so there's still some bottlenecks that the government and other stakeholders are working to overcome. But I think, you know, you have to do both of those things. You have to allow people to feel the economic value, but at the same time raise the financial value. And those are 2 of the takeaways for me, and as a mangrove manager, from this report that maybe aren't so apparent. Maybe Gordon has something to say about that as well.
Yeah, if I can use this as a segue to some of the other questions that have come in on the chat. First, the observation, there's an institutional question here of governance, is that, as Ben pointed out, if the mangroves are collectively owned and managed, but developed land is individually owned, somebody may come in and if the institutions aren't strong enough for the collective ownership and management of the land, somebody can capture that value by putting in a shrimp pond and gain ownership. And so that's a governance and an institution issue. But to follow up with Ben and some of the other questions asked about, can you have integration of development for aquaculture and conservation that maintains the values of the mangroves, the ecosystem service values. And Ben will probably talk about this more, but if you look at your landscape, it's going to depend on the actual dynamics of that location and the shape of the mangroves. If you have a large area of mangroves and you're careful to do very minimal disruption of the hydrology, and you leave much of the length of the coastline of mangroves for erosion protection and storm protection and fisheries, yes, it should be possible to take a modest portion of that area and put it into aquaculture, as long as you understand the ecological dynamics of that system and don't impinge on them very much. And I'll turn it over to Ben.
Okay, good segue. In some landscapes, aquaculture doesn't belong, like deltas, the Mahakam Delta, Barao Delta of East Kalimantan. It's just highly organic matter, pyritic soils, and it goes acid sulfate when those are exposed to the atmosphere, and they're not productive. So they should stay in mangroves. Another landscape I work in northern Sulawesi is adjacent to very deep water with some upwelling, and it's a good place for aquaculture. And I guess what I'm saying is there needs to be a little more landscape-specific study of what the thresholds are between mangrove coverage and aquaculture coverage, And when is, you know, there's a crossing of a threshold where you drastically lose the value of ecosystem services. And there's multiple thresholds you can cross. And we've seen that in Java, where the entire coastline of the North Shore is eroding and subsiding, and there's not balance with like sedimentation, natural geomorphological processes. So I guess part of the R in CEADIR I just learned tonight is about resilience. And I guess I close this little thought referring to resilience, speaking about thresholds and system states and things like that. Indonesia, finally, recently, the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries made a statement and some policy and mandates that there will be no more conversion of mangroves to aquaculture by law anymore. And they're going for an 80-20 split, like a landscape mosaic, 80% mangrove cover versus 20% aquaculture, which is in the literature a little bit. The Philippines also have a similar regulation. I would call 80-20 to me is not the magic number. It's good, it's a conservative number, but landscape specific studies are really required to understand how much aquaculture could exist in a landscape before you degrade into a different system state. And I think, let's see, I'm losing myself in my thoughts, but I kind of wanted to close on something. Where should the aquaculture be located? Inland, maybe linearly, a little vertically, but keeping a coastal green belt's important. And realistically, there's some landscapes which are 90% aquaculture, 99% aquaculture, and it's going to be hard to get back to 80% mangrove coverage in those landscapes. Anyway, sorry, I'm starting to lose myself. It's 11:30 at night here in Darwin.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
So we have another question. The basic thesis of the presentation was that the economic value of mangrove forests are mainly based on carbon storage. And so the conservation of the swamps would then be more beneficial to the community. But how do you, when it's carbon storage, it's very hard to communicate those benefits to the community. Those are really global benefits. And so how do you parse that? What is the strategy there? Are there really not more local benefit? And if so, why would people not want to go ahead and convert?
So, two comments. The first one is that the methods of cost benefit analysis makes the financial values low because these are very remote areas that are a long ways from markets, and they have traditionally been used as free access. So the prices that get attributed to extracted goods tend to be basically the cost of labor, and the people in these areas have very low labor prices. So first of all, some people might argue that we're undercounting and the values to the local people. And now to get back more directly to the question about carbon values, I'll try to be brief here because I think we could get into unproductive discussions. There's been a lot of talk for 20 years about carbon markets and carbon credits, and I've worked on that for a quarter century. I suspect, because yes, you're right, that the climate value is a global value, and only people, the local people only are a very tiny percentage of the global population, and so they only accrue a tiny percentage of that global value of climate stabilization. So then I think it's a question of what's an institutionally fair and workable method for, basically helping these people contribute to the global benefit. And I think that selling carbon credits is probably not the ideal method, but I think we should maybe have a separate webinar on institutional options for how you might compensate local communities for providing these global ecosystem services. I should stop there.
Okay, thank you. This might be our last question, depending on the answer. Could you talk briefly about the degree to which you may expect other locations to follow these general findings? How generalizable is this study? Are there particular things that are unique about it, or that limit wider application of the results?
I'll do two super quick points, and then Ben's the expert on this. One is, remember, these are really big, deep, undisturbed areas. They're not strips. So strips are going to behave differently than big, deep areas. And these are in very remote sites that are both remote from markets, and they're very protected sites from tsunamis and cyclones. And much of the rest of the world, a significant amount of the value is going to be storm protection. Even when we added storm protection, because the value of the infrastructure is so low, we got small storm protection value. And in other locations, storm protection value is going to be big. And the populations were low here. Ben, off to you.
Yeah, I think you handled that well. Well, there's not many places in Indonesia or elsewhere that are like Mimika and Bintuni with such vast mangroves. And I don't know that we captured their true value in this study as well as we could, to be honest, and to me, they're undervalued. I guess I'm going to close by going back to my thoughts on mangroves and aquaculture and landscape mosaics, kind of a mangrove aquaculture agroecosystem. A lot of Indonesia's already been eastern coast of Sumatra, south and east Kalimantan, most of Sulawesi, the north shore of Java, and a few other landscapes wholly converted to aquaculture. And there, I just want to, I guess a word of caution in closing to me, that some of this progress that has been made about at the ministerial level, thinking about 80 to 20% ratios, mangroves to aquaculture, in practice have to also be thought through. And I think what's important and maintains the value of mangrove system is what Gordon mentioned earlier, connectivity. That you have a whole forest stand that's connected to the shore. It floods and drains naturally. It is fisheries refugia and nursery value, et cetera, like that. And then you'll maintain this high mangrove value. My fear is that these things will be misconstrued, and like if you have a square, which people like to own, it's still that public-private or privatization of the commons kind of issue. If you have a rectangle or a square that's got, and there's a mandate that says you need 80% mangroves and 20% intensified aquaculture, for instance, there's a fear that that will be put inside of the square, inside of the dike walls, 80% mangroves growing with maybe some ponds in a form of silver fisheries. But there's none that's satisfied me. Global research about the value of silver fisheries, especially its ecosystem service value, how it keeps mangroves diverse or healthy or resilient. They're really vulnerable in that setting. A flood can wash over the dike walls. Mangroves are susceptible to drowning. If they're submerged for too long, 24 hours, sometimes 2 weeks, they can die quite quickly. We've seen that when landscapes subside because of earthquakes. And so I think the important thing is to kind of understand in this mangrove aquaculture talk that we were having, that a lot of questions are still in the chat about, that you have to put some value on the connectivity of the system of mangroves intact, and really pay attention to like landscape specific measurements of appropriate mosaics, sustainable mosaics, and where the thresholds are, and not crossing one, let alone several thresholds which lead to this total collapse of the coast, and it's no good for local people, investors, or really society at large. So I didn't answer that the way maybe we were expecting, but those are the thoughts that are in my mind, because I don't know how to address the issue of carbon sales necessarily, which is still, there's some people on this call who are better at that, I'm sure, and we could use another webinar about achieving blue carbon in Indonesia and elsewhere. Anyway, thanks.
All right, thank you. We are over time, so we're going to have to wrap up. There are a lot of really interesting questions that came in through the chat and through the live stream that we have not had a chance to get to. We will share in a follow-up email additional resources that can help get at those questions. And you have the email addresses of all of us who have been presenting. So if you have more questions, you can email. And I just want to thank everyone for joining this webinar, and hopefully we can keep this conversation going in some other remote ways.
Thank you very much, Julian. Thanks to our panelists.
Thanks to all. All right.
Goodbye.
Selamat malam.
Terrific. So that wraps up our webinar for today. If folks, I can see starting to log out, which is great. You can take this opportunity to log out now. If we don't see you logged out in a few minutes, we may remove you from the meeting, but we have enjoyed having you here. And thanks so much for listening in.